Let's move on to number 5, and that is that Lincoln Mercury salespeople and sales leadership originally hated the Mark III and wanted nothing to do with the car. Now, this seems strange given the sales success that the Mark III had, but in the beginning, the sales folks just wanted nothing to do with the Mark III. They hated the fact that it had this fake Rolls-Royce grille and the Continental spare tire hump. Design elements that really were a throwback rather than a look forward, and they were vehemently opposed to the car. However, it was really shoved down their throat by Lee Iacocca, who thought that this was the exact vehicle that Lincoln Mercury needed. And in the end, the car absolutely printed money. Ford made about $500-ish on each vehicle that is sold, or about the equivalent of $5,000 today. So once the car started selling and the profits rolled in, you can imagine that Lincoln Mercury leadership just folded and decided that this was a good idea, and obviously continued the theme into the Mark IV and the Mark V as years went on. But when the car was originally introduced, Lincoln Mercury leadership was completely against it. Let's move on to number 4, and that is that the Mark III introduced the moonroof to the Ford Motor Company and generally to the industry. Now, before this time, the sunroof was something that was becoming increasingly popular in vehicles, and there was a company in Detroit area named American Sunroof, led by Heinz Proctor, who was responsible for putting quite a few sunroofs in cars. In fact, many of which were done as factory options. So whether you got a GM, a Ford, or a Chrysler, when you ordered the sunroof, oftentimes it was a car that was shipped from the factory to American Sunroof to have the sunroof installed. And they were really high-class installations. These were not chop jobs, and Heinz Proctor's outfit did a great job. But one of the things that had not been done up until this point was to have not just a sunroof, but what Lincoln Mercury called the moonroof. And the difference was the sunroof was effectively a movable roof panel that was not transparent. You couldn't see through it. But the moonroof was a piece of glass that you could see through and was reflective on the outer side so that it helped really just defray the sun's rays. It was something that Lincoln Mercury worked on with American Sunroof to introduce on the Mark III, and an entirely new, let's say, type of removable roof panel was born. And today, when you get a sunroof in a car, it effectively is a moonroof, and everybody just calls it a sunroof. But before the Mark III, a sunroof, again, meant something that was not transparent. The moonroof was a transparent panel, and Lincoln Mercury partnered with American Sunroof on this particular design. Let's move on to number 3, and that is that the Mark III had wheel covers that were based on similar designs for classic cars. When the Mark III was originally being conceived, it was felt that there wasn't enough money for wheel covers. However, by this time, Bucky Newton was in charge of Ford Motor Company, and one of the things that the design team articulated him that they really wanted for this car with its own unique wheel cover. They felt that the standard Continental wheel covers just weren't going to do. Funky approved, and as a result, designers went over to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn to take a look at some classic wheel covers to get some inspiration, and they found this kind of center octagonal hub design on various Packards and Rolls-Royces and other cars of the era that they thought was compelling and unique, and they decided to embrace that theme and put it on the wheel cover for the Mark III. It also would end up being a feature of a number of other wheel covers for some time, but this is where it originally started, and again, the inspiration was Packards and Rolls-Royces, the true classic cars of yesteryear. Once again, let's listen to Dave Ash describe how designers took inspiration from these cars in constructing the Mark III's wheel cover. Let's move on to number 2, and that is that engineers thought that the Mark III was designed with too much front overhang. The Mark III design was supposed to have a long hood just to give it an overall prominent form, and it certainly worked. It was a technique that was also employed on the '69 Grand Prix and other vehicles to give the car a more European flair, if we can believe that, for a car this large. But the typical European styling of the time had what was called long hood, short deck, or long hood, kind of a shorter trunk proportions, and that's what was true for the Mark III as well. However, recall that the Mark III was based on the Thunderbird 4-door platform, And as a result, in order to get the extra long hood, engineers had to add body, in effect, ahead of the front axles. And what that meant is that the front overhang was quite substantial. Now, overhang is generally not a desirable trait for vehicles because if you have weight over the front axle, as an example, it makes it harder for the car to handle appropriately because you all that weight out front, and it also may tend to dive on braking and wallow in corners. But, of course, the Mark III was set up for a luxury ride, not to handle. In any event, engineers tried to force designers to trim about 4 inches off of the front overhang, but they ended up proving unsuccessful. But that was their desire. Once again, Dave Ash. And that leaves us with number 1, and that was the styling on the Mark III was Lee Iacocca's idea. Here you see a proposal for the Mark III dated October 12, 1965, and this is before Lee Iacocca had a phone call that he placed first to Jean Bourdonnais, who was in Europe, and then Lee Iacocca rang Dave Ash to describe his idea. Notice here the car has no Rolls-Royce front end, and we turn to the back, you'll see it also doesn't have that Continental trunk hump either, but it does have hidden headlamps. It has a very rectilinear grille with thin bars associated with it. The wheel arches are significantly different, has a large body side molding, and it's overall, I'll say, more conventional than the Mark III. The upper structure is pretty similar to what would end up on the Mark III with the A-pillars, the windshield, the door, and the door glass. But the rest of the car is quite different. Let's take a look at the rear of some of these proposals as well. Now you see here that the rear in this proposal, which is different from the previous one but similar, still has that large body side molding, the squiggle style wheel arches up front, and the overall theme is quite similar, but of course there's a vinyl roof on this model. There wasn't on the previous one. You'll notice the vertical style taillights a la Cadillac, and there's an absence of a Continental style trunk hump here. So this was what the Mark III was going to look like. And if you can read it on the rear quarter panel, you'll see that it says Lancelot, because that was the name of the car at this point. It was not the Mark III. It was actually the Lancelot in the style of King Arthur, similar to Merlin, in fact. And again, this was a name that was bestowed upon the car by Dave Ash. If we look at the front end of a similar proposal from that time frame, you'll actually see it says Lancelot there on the driver's side above the headlight, kind of in a humorous script too. And you get a sense of that rectilinear grille with these very thin, delicate-looking bars. And again, no Rolls-Royce front end. But I have to say, one of the details that I love about this front end is the hood ornament. Notice that there is a hood ornament on this Mark III. There was not a hood ornament on the final car, in part because this was the era of Ralph Nader and unsafe at any speed, and it was felt that those types of hood ornaments could potentially impale people, so cars just left them off. But here you do see that the proposal for the Lancelot has a hood ornament, and take a look at it. It actually is kind of a Lincoln logo, but instead of just being a typical Lincoln logo or the Continental Star, it has a sword in the middle of it poking through. While you can imagine that in this era of unsafe at any speed and Ralph Nader and safety advocacy, that having a hood ornament with a sword protruding through it was not a great idea, and so that was scrapped, along with the Lancelot name. The Lancelot name would actually be changed by Lee Iacocca, who decided to christen the car the Mark III, effectively forgetting about the Mark III, 4, and 5 that were introduced in 1958, 59, and 60, and that were kind of fake marks, if you will. They were just tarted up Lincolns. Here, Iacocca wanted to effectively forget the public to forget those 58, 9, and 60 Mark III, 4, and 5, and name the car the Mark III. In any case, here is a proposal from a time frame after Iacocca called Dave Ash and told him to put the Rolls-Royce grille on the front and the Continental hump in the rear. You can see it's totally changed the character of the front end, but it actually looks quite handsome, and the wheel arches are changed too to something that's more production ready. Of course, that fender skirt would get removed, and that character line, the lower character line, would also not make it through to production. Friend would also go through a number of revisions. I think it says Lincoln over the top of the grille bars as well on this, and that would get removed too. But Lee Iacocca ended up calling Dave Ash when he was on a trip in Canada to tell him to put this Rolls-Royce grille and the Continental hump on the style. Because Iacocca and Ash and Gene Bourdonnais just felt that the previous models that you saw didn't quite have that panache and verb that they were looking for. And at first, when Dave Ash heard the Iacocca's request, he actually thought that it was pretty reasonable and thought, gosh, that's something that we never would have thought of because it was anachronistic. It was looking back to the past as opposed to forward to the future. But at the end of the day, both Ash and then forward styling VP Gene Bourdonnais agreed that Iacocca's proposal was handsome and distinctive. And you can see here in the rear that Continental spare tire type hump, which was characteristic of what Iacocca wanted. The car is also still very clearly called the Lancelot here. You can see the script on the rear quarter panel. And I love that large sword logo on the deck lid. Of course, that would be changed when the car was changed from the Lancelot to the Mark III. And that fender skirt would also be changed. The body side molding would be removed as well. And there you have the story and the top 10 facts you didn't know about the 69 to 71 Lincoln Continental Mark III. Hope you enjoyed this video. What was your favorite fact? Put it in the description. Thanks again for watching.